Welcome back, everyone, to the 2021 virtual edition of the Brooklyn Antiquarian Book Fair. We're very happy to have special guest with us now, Erik Davis, who is a tremendous writer, author, journalist, scholar, and seeker who has a long history of writing for many of the top publications in America and abroad. Also published several landmark books, including Technosis in 1998, which was really the first kind of scholarly look into knowledge, spirituality, and technology and where those kind of things met. Had a huge sort of nonfiction presence during the era of like The Matrix and cyberpunk and William Gibson's books and the interest in Philipkdick in the 90s. And then he actually did work on the exegesis of Philipkdick in 2011, which was a compendium of the notes about Philipkdick's valistrilogy and his hallucinations. Erik wrote a book called Visionary State about California intentional communities and subcultures and where they were sort of plotted in the various topography around California. And in the last few years, he wrote probably his most influential and well-received book, Weirdness, a book about the 70s sci-fi literature and some of the major authors like Philipkdick and Robertantonwilson and terrencemckenna, who were also interested in things like the occult and hallucinogenic drugs. And so I want to welcome Erik Davis and, just give a huge thanks for having you on our program. It's truly an honor.
Happy to be here.
Let's start right in. You were recently in the documentary A Glitch in the Matrix about simulation theory. And, really one of the more articulate speakers in that film. How does that all fit into this cosmology that you've been working on for, 20, 30 years now as a researcher?
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, in a way, it's the same kind of conundrum, which, in technological terms, we can think of as like, is reality just a simulation? Am I stuck inside of some kind of computer matrix? But the basic question of, is the entire world around me actually an illusion, of course, goes back to ancient times, and particularly in the East, we have the Zhuangzi's famous story about waking up from a dreaming that he was a butterfly, and is he actually a butterfly dreaming he's a man? And if you go into Hindu mythology or South Asian mythology, you'll find over and over again there are these elaborate stories of people sort of falling asleep and living whole lives and then waking up and realizing it was all a dream. And that question of like, is reality a dream, is actually, I believe, stitched into human consciousness from the get-go, because we all dream. That means that universally, and this is, it's hard to make universal statements these days because they tend to be politically challenging and people don't like universalism with human beings, but we all dream, which means we all have the experience of sort of being somewhere and then, whoosh, oh, wow, what was that? And that little gap, that little crack is with all of us. And so it's almost inevitable that you kind of ask the question, maybe this is one of those things, that this world around me. So it's really interesting, and that's part of my work, is like tracing how these kind of older, if you want to think about it, mythological or spiritual or metaphysical problems get reiterated and reframed in technological terms. And so that was, what drew me to Philipkdick when I first started to read him in the 1980s, and I wrote about him for my senior thesis at Yale at a time when not that many, people in science fiction paid attention to Dick, and there was already criticism of his work back through the 70s, but mostly people didn't really know that much about him, even in literary culture. And I was always interested in this question of how these old, call them Gnostic problems, is the world of an illusion or a trap, how they get reframed in technological terms. And then I kind of kept tracking that stuff forward through Technosis. It was one of the themes, not the dominant one even, but one of the themes in Technosis was tracing that. And then the Matrix films came out, as you said, and I was like, case closed. It's like, that was like, proof positive, because that was before. And so, it was all it was all kind of lined up. And, you know, there was so much stuff happening with technology over the last 20 years, lots of different mythological and non-mythological forces, you know, changing our world. But the sort of simulation theory and hypothesis and the way that it popped back into popular culture was kind of a revision of this like long-standing conundrum, which again I think is sort of stitched into the picture. Like there's once you're clued into it, once your brain can model those questions, it's kind of hard to completely resolve the problem. So it sort of stays with you as sort of like gum under your shoe. And I think it will always haunt technological culture, and it will probably get even more so. I mean, I think it's perfectly reasonable to imagine a future where the physical world becomes more and more grueling, more and more cut off from pleasure and possibility, more and more, you know, weather's going to be worse, more people, you know, and the attraction of virtual realities that are already getting incredibly robust will be incredible, because it's not just that they're fun, but like, you know, everybody in the game, corporations, governments, military, intelligence, everybody wants you there, because that's where you can be tracked. That's where we know what's going on. It's like, so there's so many forces that are pressing people into that kind of experience. It's inevitable that these myths or science fictions will become more and more part of people's everyday lives, and in a way that kind of even further erodes our already tentative sense of consensus reality holding us kind of together.
With that in mind, can we go back to technosis really quickly? Do you see technosis as reflecting like 1997, 98?
Oh, that's a good question. No, it's very much of its time. You know, I felt like I was sort of, to be honest, a little bit captured by the muse on that one, although it's not quite a muse, because the muse is more like a poetic source, and this was a little bit more like a, not prophetic, but like just, there was something vatic about the process. Like I was putting things together, and the way that book came about, you know, as I said, I wrote about Philip-K. in the 80s. And so I was always interested in this crossover of mysticism and esotericism and technology, and seeing it in fiction, like you say, that's sort of the obvious place. And I was into cyberpunk and wrote about it for The Nation in the late 80s and stuff like that. But in a way, the more interesting stuff was not in the fictional realm. It was in the sort of realm of esotericism or religion or religious experience. And I started to see how deep these archetypes went, and that they went outside of the sort of relatively safe space of fiction or music. And so I just started to collect it, essentially, like kind of archive these moments of these juxtapositions, whether they were historical, like reading a book about the history of magic and just coming across things that, well, that sounds kind of like a computer, and just sort of logging that, or looking out into contemporary culture and collecting examples of this kind of religious or mystical thinking. And so I gathered it through the 90s. And I was very much a creature of the early to mid 90s, which was a really extraordinary time in people in our generations. You know, we're roughly the same age, probably a little older, but you know, it was a real groovy time. And it was a sense of spacious opening, of experiment, of possibilities. Subculture was surging back. There was interesting psychedelia, interesting music coming in, a real sense of mixology, of juxtapositions and mutants and potentials. And so I was, as a critic and an essayist writing a lot for Village Voice and other magazines, I was really in that moment. And so I had been collecting this stuff, and then sometime around that mid 90s period, it was like already sensing like, okay, that's kind of going away, and like watching what was happening to the web as someone who, you know, I was never an internet utopian, because I've always been too critical. I know too much about history to be that utopian. But, you know, that was part of my world, and I knew a lot of those people. I thought they were legitimate ideas and legitimate hopes in many ways. And so already it was clear that things were going to change sort of quickly, and with the growth of Wired magazine, which I wrote for, and the growth of the kind of wealth economy around it, it was already strange. And I had moved to San Francisco at that point. I was living in Brooklyn actually in the early 90s. And, already the kind of dot-com bubble was happening and everyone was talking about money. And so it was already like the bloom was off the rose. And that's kind of when I holed up. And I took 2 years to write the thing. It was grueling, definitely the hardest I've ever done writing. It was just really difficult. And so I think it very much is about that transition point and a sense of things closing down and things getting a bit more bland, and then me trying to like revive or keep alive, even in the dark ways, even in the scary, freaky ways, but to keep alive that sense of possibility, of strangeness, of threat, of mutation, just in a way to keep things interesting. I'm just really happy. I mean, Technosis is still in print. It's still selling. The fact that I could write a book about technology that's 25 years old and is still relevant to people, to young people, like that just kind of blows my mind. And part of it is that I was cynical enough that I could see the dark side. And when I look at it now, I'm like, yeah, sure, great. Here comes the New World Order, here comes surveillance, here comes conspiracy, here comes apocalypticism. It's part of the picture that I was sort of tapping into. And unfortunately, I would rather that we were in one of the utopias that people were imagining in the early 1990s.
I'm sort of wondering, what was it in your background that maybe go back to, since this is a book fair, go back to your earlier years and let me know about the things that sort of influenced you in terms of collecting. When did you become aware maybe that you had an interest in spirituality, which I know you did a religious studies PhD. Also, when did you become interested in some of these subjects that had to do with metaphysics or hallucinogens? And how did that sort of change you as you were this, we as journalists have to be cynical, we have to be critical. And yet at the same time, like, I know for me, as a historian, when I read your book, like it really galvanized me because I had come out of film school hoping to make sort of boilerplate documentaries about big subjects like, Ken Burns' Civil War or jazz. I thought I was going to be sort of like the heir apparent to that. And here I found myself being much more inclined to magic and bending the rules of nonfiction, both in, my own journalism. I was really inspired by what you were doing. And I took to calling myself a creative historian because I realized that I was collecting all of this material, but then I was allowing it to sort of reveal itself to me without putting too much of a rigorous academic framework on it, but seeing what the connections between things that maybe were not so academic or not so clear and how they might produce this new vision of things. So it was really a big thing for me to read that book and sort of a kind of a new way of looking at history. And again, if you could just kind of retrace your own steps looking back now.
Sure. No, I mean, I'm really happy to hear that because it wasn't like I was entirely intentional in that, in the sense that my mind just kind of works that way. I think one way of approaching it is that I took, I grew up in Southern California in the end of the 70s, early 1980s, so the tail end of the counterculture. So I was surrounded by the bric-a-brac of the counterculture. And one thing about my generation, that particular time, is that when we were kids, we grew up consuming media that was produced by heads. So like I looked at Heavy Metal magazine, I was interested, and I always liked the dark stuff. So I went to the underground comics or, the things that were more spicy or whatever. So in a way, my kind of like cultural mother's milk was like freaks. And so I was always fascinated by that experience growing up. And then where I grew up, it was also just around me. So I took acid when I was 13. I saw the dead. And when I was a teen, in high school, I, hung out with Hare Krishnas. We went to a Zen place. I'd occasionally run into like wandering mendicants in white robes who were like these hippies that were part of like a cult that Charles Manson had known. And we can go into the details about Fountain Grove and stuff like that. But so this was just like my actual experience. I had a teacher in the public high school who had been an est leader, and he sort of did these sort of est-like classes. I don't know how they got away with it, but it was, you know, the early 80s in Southern California. So I absorbed all this stuff, and it just always inspired me, because I think part of me always, you know, I'm very much a modern soul, in that I feel the attraction towards an enchanted world. And yet I'm very aware of the ways in which the world is not enchanted. And that kind of critical, skeptical side was always a part of my view. You know, I always, you know, one of my first introductions to the whole freak world was Hunter Thompson. Like I was reading Hunter Thompson when I was 12 years old, 13 years old, and sort of emulating that kind of cynicism but still kind of fascination and exuberance with things. And so I think that enabled me to kind of develop what in high weirdness I call a kind of tightrope walker approach, where like you go into the weird, but you kind of keep your solid, or a solid orientation or a critical orientation. But because you can trust the critical orientation, you can let the magic happen more. You don't need to control it. Just like you were saying, one of the methods, and it's still a method that I use for a lot of projects, is I just start gathering quotes and archives and bits and ideas, and then it's in this big mess, and I just start writing, and then like things fall together and connections are made, and then I kind of riff on a connection and it opens up another connection. So it's very much like I'm inside the jungle, as it were, moving forward, kind of getting hints and seeing patterns, rather than starting out with like a clear idea or a thesis or some idea of where I'm necessarily going to end. Doesn't always make for the most efficient writing process, but it allows the objects of objective history, or, you know, whatever objective is, but like the archive, it lets the archive itself begin to hallucinate, the way that if you like go into a bookstore, how do I go through the bookstore? Well, I can go and look for the books I want, or I can just stop with this one book and look at it. Or I can start letting the books talk to each other, and look how this one is over there. And wait, the color looks the same as this one over here. And then suddenly you're in the kind of process that can lead into madness, where everything is connected to everything else, and all these synchronicities and coincidences. And you know, I've always been inspired by those kinds of experiences too. So I think partly as an intellectual, my goal was to allow the objects themselves, the archive, or the things that resonated with me, you know, reveal their connections, and then kind of manage that or curate that, and then sort of, you know, make jokes about it too, so people don't think it's too serious about it. You know, in some ways, I'm in this weird generational. The Gen X is a fascinating generation, because we're the last kids who grew up in an analog world. I remember the first computer I saw was a DEC 10 at my father's work. It was, you know, one of those huge old punch card machines, and I used to look at the punch cards and how does this make it go? And I played Adventure, which was one of the earliest sort of text-based games on the, you know, the sort of orange CRT monitors, where you're at the end of a windy path. What do? You know, that kind of thing. And then a friend of mine's had a little Altair and whatever. So I remember and was fascinated by computers when I first saw them, but they definitely entered in from outside. And at the same time, we kind of missed this huge cultural revolution that left all this flotsam and jetsam everywhere that was kind of our world. So it's a funny sort of liminal generation in a lot of ways. And I feel deeply of that. And that's part of my sensibilities, that I'm deeply rooted in that particular generation. And so the kind of relationship to objects that has is like, in a way, my generation, I often feel, is kind of a collector generation. We were sort of like, well, we didn't get to live it, but we can like archive it, and we can get passionate about it. I mean, the passion that we brought to like the stuff we liked and the stuff we didn't like I just thought that was the way kids were. And then later on, when I was teaching, and I would be teaching younger people, all right, what about the bands, man? What's the best? And it's like, oh, I like this, or this is kind of cool. I saw this video the other day, and I'm like, whoa, you guys are like totally different than the way like me and my friends were when we were the same age as you are. Like there's just something different. There's like this obsessive, angsty quality, I believe.
Wikipedia culture and colleges really encourage general studies now rather than connoisseurship. I mean, not even in an academic way. I get what you're saying because I'm Gen X too, as you said. And you know, in the late 80s, early 90s, the thing when you met somebody new that you had a kind of a feeling they were cool was like, the first thing you want to know is like, what are you into?
Yeah.
You know, and if you both liked Nick Drake, but somebody else liked Love and you liked the Beach Boys psychedelic stuff, like you could turn each other on to these things that were not a part of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame or Rolling Stone narrative. And all of a sudden we were able to like sort of reinvent the canon in a way. And that was so exciting because things were coming out because people were obsessive and they were getting into things. But I guess, you know, one question I have, because I know from personal experience when I got into academia and I moved to New York City, and you and I have a similar path in that regard, a lot of the stuff that I liked as a kid, the bric-a-brac, as you called it, like stuff that I would find from like High Times or finding a half of a Playboy in a gutter or whatever, or like getting into Ed Big Daddy Roth's monsters, not even knowing that somebody created them. They just seemed to magically appear out of gumball machines and at skate shops or whatever. And it was like, yeah, that monster's me. And then going home and spending weeks making monsters of my own friends or whatever, and starting our own skate club or whatever. It's like when I got to New York and I got into academia and all of that, I became so critical and sort of like pretentious in a way that I started to really doubt the stuff that was so spontaneous as a kid. And I, you know, in being so intentional, I really kind of started to lose touch with that. And I think, you know, it wasn't until like books like Technosis and some other things that really influenced me in the 2000s that I started to take a look back and say, you know, that stuff that was formative, like, you know, there's no way I'm going to go back to the simplicity of what I was when I was first discovering this, because Pandora's box has been opened and I've been exposed now to some high culture. But at the same time, like, I feel like I can appreciate that level of spontaneity without doubting it so much. And I think that's when I started to move away from wanting to be just a total like writer for the New Yorker or whatever. I mean, I wrote for the Village Voice like you, but I stopped moving in that path because I started to become more enamored with the non-academic, non-liberal arts version and started getting more open to magic and conspiracies and things that were outside the mainstream that was like, you know, sort of easily dismissed, you know, by the high-minded journalists and critics. But I felt like it was pointing to something that was much richer and more open-minded. And I really didn't like the fact that I felt like I was putting limitations on my mind. That became really discomforting to me at a time. And the Philipkdick research that you did, that was such an eye-opener for me because I love the valistrilogy so much, and have always been drawn to this idea of like a pink beam in the sky, or, you know, Mike Oldfield's Tubular Bells in the Sky. I used to smoke pot and listen to that album and think, is this album actually about like an effigy that is in the sky? And so I would have this kind of worship experience. And so, you know, I guess the question is, was there a point where you sort of doubted it and then a point where you came back, and how did you get
I like the way you framed that question. I think I had a slightly different experience, but not a terribly different one. And I think it's also a very important overall pattern. Like my advisor at Rice, where I went and got my PhD, you know, I started about a decade ago. So it was a late career PhD. I didn't go to graduate school after undergrad. He talks about the study of religion in that way. He says it's like there's these three models. There's like the first phase is kind of celebratory. It's like if you're teaching people world religion, the first phase is celebratory. Like, look at all these amazing religions, all these different religions. They're so cool and wild, flipped out, right? And then you go into the critical phase where you're like, well, there's some problems, and you learn how to disenchant, how to deconstruct, how to contextualize, how to historicize, how to critique. so that's where a lot of people get, and they don't get farther than that. And what he talks about is that, like, you don't really get into you're not really becoming a kind of a scholar until you get to this third phase, which he calls like sort of a Gnostic phase, which is one where you realize the critical dimension, and you see that it's very true within its zone, but that you're kind of required or driven to reconnect with some of those deeper sources, but in a new way. And so it means that you reframe these earlier stories. And so suddenly pop cultural things, while kind of maybe chintzy in their own terms, are actually symbolic or resonant with deeper patterns and problems that are not sufficiently dealt with by the critical mind. And so I went through a kind of version of that going to Yale, which was super intellectual, full of deconstruction and all that kind of thing. But there was something in me that I think it's just that my high school experience in Southern California was so weird and intense that I was already like, inside a pretty weird guy. And I was just kind of learning these external tools, but I was always like wanting to find a way back. And it just took me a long time to do it. And in a way, Technosis was the alchemy of weaving together my critical intelligence and historical skills and research skills and journalistic skills with these deeper mysteries.
So can you talk to me a little bit about how you got involved and how you got the deal to work on Philip's papers around?
Yeah. How did exactly it happened? I already knew Jonathan Lethem, and I was just I knew a couple of people who were around the project. I hadn't met Pamela Jackson, who was the main editor. She's really the one who did it. I mean, like, Jonathan helped a lot. I helped a lot as sort of an editorial assistant, but she's the one who really read this thing or knew it, inside and out. And basically, she just needed an assistant. And so when Jonathan knew of me, or knew me, I think we'd met or something. But through mutual friends, somebody just suggested that I might be a good person to come in and just sort of help her do a lot of. So I had my specific editorial task, which was editing the kind of annotations that people wrote, these sort of responses that we got a dozen people to write. But I did a lot more than that too, just kind of helping figure out how to do this triage process. And I mean, it was crazy. It's just such a, what it would have taken to really do it sort of tightly and crisply, like the way that a well-funded academic research institution would have done compared to what we were doing. I mean, we were doing the philipkdick version of that, which is that we didn't have any money. We were obsessive, overworked. It's a mess. It's just insane. It's an insane text. You can't grapple. It just goes through your hands. It's a crazy process. So
it was process driven. I mean, it captures process more than product.
Exactly. It's very, very process driven. So how do you edit that? How do you show that? Do you include the crap? It's like I read a scholarly piece the other day about moksha, liberation, in philipkdick. And the guy was, kind of pushing back on he's like, well, it's not just about weird, man. It's about like visionary experience. And there's something consistent in Dick's work. And bless the guy's heart. He had pulled something out that was very beautiful about Dick and seeing the world and putting that in a larger metaphysical context and seeing him as a visionary. And you're like, yeah, that's there. But the crazy stuff is also right there. And in fact, there's a lot more of it. And so the problem is not whether or not he had cogent, beautiful, profound ideas that were beautifully expressed. That's just not a question. And the problem is, what do we do with this text where those things are pearls in a vast field of paranoid pulp and pathology? And for me, this brought into one of the really, I'm thinking of two things right now that this conversation is bringing up for me. But to finish the thought is that one of the things that motivated me in High Weirdness is just that why do we have to decide between pathology and genuine mystical experience? What if they're both true? And in fact, usually found together or often found together. And we just give up trying to say, to either like justify the crazy shit because we love the brilliant transcendental visions, or reducing and deconstructing the mystical stuff because obviously it's driven by pathology and the brain and da. Those both seem kind of boring to me. That we get closer to the human condition, particularly in our period of time, when we're like, yeah, they're both there. In fact, they're deeply woven into one another. What are we going to do with that?
Tell me about high weirdness, the experience of that, the reception of that, the writing of that. If you could just kind of go into that and maybe from a personal point of view, but also the difference of culture between those 7 or 8 years between exegesis and high weirdness.
Yeah, it's amazing. It's a great question. It was quite a journey because and it had to do with my decision to get a PhD. It's something I always sort of wanted. I was just sort of felt like there were a lot of personal reasons to do it, just because it was sort of like an outward bound program or something. Like I wanted to test it and I wanted to check that box. Like I can write a PhD and I can get a PhD and I can write a dissertation and get it out there or whatever. And I kind of wanted to change in my life, and it gave me a way to sort of hide from the market for a while. I was just like, that's all I was doing. I was just a student, and I got to sort of, have almost like a vacation of sorts. And it really worked out. There were great people at the university, but I went in there, going to write about philipkdick. I mean, I came in having edited, helped edit the exegesis. Obviously, my topic should just be philipkdick and the exegesis, and there's definitely enough material just to do a book. And I was always just going to write about that. And then literally, like at the last minute, like I had already structured my dissertation and gotten the chapters and sort of identified what I was going to do. And then something in me clutched, and I just went, no, I don't want to do that. I don't want to spend 3 years inside philipkdick's head. And so I just popped back, and then immediately it was just very clear that I wanted to write about, initially I was going to do more compare and contrast between these different visions that McKenna and robertantonwilson had alongside philipkdick. And maybe I was going to put John Lilly in there, who also had sort of sci-fi, druggy, cybernetic, mystical, deeply 70s kinds of experiences, who was also spending a lot of time in California. So it was like, it became more of like a zeitgeist book. And while I didn't end up going into that much detail about what connected everything, they all resonate. And it also forced me to come up with a cultural map of the era that was something that I'd long wanted to do. I've always been fascinated by the early 70s, which is not coincidentally when I was first coming to consciousness, as a 5-year-old, 6-year-old, whatever.
Wait. Is high weirdness based on your dissertation?
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Okay.
No, I went in and I was like, no, I told him, I said, I'm going to write a book. That's what I'm going to do. And in fact, when I turned in the dissertation, it was way too long. The thing that all 3 of my readers agreed on was that it was very long. They were all like, well, your dissertation is very long, because I just wrote a book. And then I revised it a lot. It took a while to revise, and I'm still not happy with everything. It was sort of hard to figure out what to do with some of the more scholarly stuff, like put it in an appendix or make the readers read it. And I'm not convinced I did it the right way, but it's fine, because I wanted to really include the more arcane scholarly part of it, because I was doing that seriously too. I mean, I still, I teach, I'm glad I have a PhD. I want my colleagues in that world to respect what I've done. So anyways,
the arcane stuff kind of harkens back to the 80s and 90s, don't you think? Because back in the day, we all wanted to know like more about the arcane stuff. We would make lists. Yeah. I mean, that's one of my favorite parts of high weirdness, is all the things I didn't know about.
Yeah. Good. That's nice. And that was the other thing as a writer. so then I did this dissertation, then I turned it into a book. And, when I'm turning in the book, I'm already aware like the world's getting really kind of weird, but I was in my zone. I didn't really need to pay too much attention to that. There's a few gestures in the text where I'm sort of going, yeah, things are getting, conspiracies, theories are changing, but I still was mostly focused on that. But for me, it was also like a writing project. I'm kind of a box checker, like, oh yeah, like, oh, a short critical music book, done that, coffee table book that's extensively illustrated. Okay. Like I like different forms. I don't want to write the same form of thing. I like, as well as the content, I'm interested in the form, and the PhD or the PhD, the dissertation book is a form. So I was like, okay, it's going to be full of gnarly footnotes. It's going to be heavily footnoted, and there's going to be a lot of stuff in it. But I still wanted to make it entertaining and have it be kind of funny and, dense and whatever. And so the notes are great. Like, I really loved creating these notes. And I know that most readers don't look at them, but the ones who do, there's a lot of Easter eggs in there, kids. So it's kind of like dense in an interesting way with more material that can, seed other people's trips or other people's voyage through the archive. So that was an important part of it. And then, so I kind of finish it, I get it out there. And then, by the time it's out, getting out there, then I'm like, okay, things are seriously nutso with the rise of the alt-right. And at this point now, it's very clear that the meme magic and like the way that all this occult stuff that was sort of more left or anarchic before has been regurgitated as sort of a right-wing tool, and Pepe the Frog. And I mean, oh my God, it was just, so when the book finally came out, I had always expected that I would be mostly talking about Philip K. Dick. Philip K. Dick is the most literary person in the book. He's sort of the most established as an important American man of letters. It's the longest section in the book. It's the most nuanced in a way. It's the one that I've been working on the longest. But in the end, I ended up talking about Robertantonwilson so much because he was the most relevant. He was the most resonant because his vision of conspiracy, his probing of the question of fake news and fake reality, his approach to hoaxing was symptomatic of things, and even somewhat in a troubling way. You can't naively celebrate his mode of hoaxing because you see the way it's actually not dissimilar from aspects of what was happening with the alt-right. And so it became for me kind of an entry into taking the conspiracy theory stuff and then eventually QAnon much more seriously. And while I didn't write about it too much, in a way I somewhat regret not writing like a big juicy piece. I did a few things on my Substack, burningshore, that were related to it, but I did a lot of podcasts because I was doing podcasts about high weirdness. And then people would talk and they'd ask me about this stuff. And then I'd talk about conspiracy theory. And then people wanted me to talk about conspiracy theory. So I basically did this like year and a half of podcasting kind of about high weirdness and kind of about QAnon and the alt-right. And so it became actually a way for me, it gave me a platform or a context or a framework to more directly address these kind of political issues. And it was quite a transformative thing for me in certain ways, because up until the late last decade, I would kind of bend over backwards for weirdos. I had friends who'd give me grief, like, you're so sympathetic to these people. It's like, come on, sometimes you just got to say you guys are nuts, right? But really, I would be anytime someone was giving me some weird riff, I'd be like, wow, let's see if I can kind of get where they're coming from. I mean, I'd go to like in Times Square, I'd go up to the Nubian Hebrews, and they have these big posters about like the white devils coming down and like, black dudes with afros, zapping them for flying saucers and killing the white devils and stuff. But I was just fascinated. I go, hey man, what's going on there? Tell me. And I just asked them, and I find one who just liked to rant. And so we'd have a conversation, and, it's like, oh, there's some kind of weird way of looking at the world. What is that? How does it work? What does it smell like? What does it taste like? So I developed a lot of sympathy for really kooky points of view. It's also it's a Gen X sensibility. We were our edge was, you know, like tolerating or being fascinated with really dark, weird stuff, you know, like that was part of the 80s underground for sure, like really, whoa, gnarly stuff that now you can't even, I don't even want to mention it, you know, but back then it was a different era, a lot more subversion in material. And so I really had that big mind, but then something happened. And I think the first thing that happened before the Q and all right kind of stuff that was set me off was the flat earth, the return of the flat earth ideology. Something broke in me. Something was like, no, you gotta be kidding. And then when I meet like hippie, you know, neo-tribal hippie festival kids who were into it, I realized that I had lost, that sympathy bone was not resonating. I was like, you guys are fucking idiots. I mean, I didn't say that, you know, but I was like, no, that's my line in the sand. Why it's that line and not something else, I don't know. And it's not like I can't construct why. I'm still interested in why that happened, or what, you know, the moon landing is fake stuff or other kind of conspiracies. I was really fascinated by it.
Yeah.
What's that?
As cultural phenomenons.
As cultural phenomena, but I lost a certain sensitivity, I think, because I sensed that something had become unhinged, that that we were off the rails, that something had gone off the rails, and that conspiracy theory, while it always had that dimension to it, and there were always anti-Semitic aspects to it or crazy pathological aspects, it was always a little dangerous, which was part of what was fun about it from the outside or from the edge of it, to be perfectly frank. Something had changed. And so then when all this stuff happens with the alt-right and meme magic and the recuperation of chaos as a kind of dark force, and then moving into the Q thing and watching QAnon happen and how it worked and how it was constructed and how conspiracy theory has been weaponized by algorithms and the breakdown of consensus and all those kind of things, like I was really up for it. And like I was in the perfect place to be able to reflect on it. But I also had to kind of come to terms with the fact that I was like, no, I don't believe that, you know, and that was hard for me to say, because it was always like, hey, who knows? I don't know. Maybe there is a circle of satanic pedophiles who are running everything. And da, da, da. But I was like, no, actually, this isn't good for us.
Well, I want to thank you so much for doing this, Erik. I would also encourage everybody who's watching or listening in to go to Burning Shore, especially your January 6th entry after what happened at the Capitol, and the comparison or the filtering through the lens of H.P. Lovecraft, who was also somewhat right-wing and conservative, but to see it through a sort of nuanced and, you know, non-binary eye. I mean, it was really a great piece. I encourage everybody to read that, as well as read Burning Shore, check out Erik's other books, and also go to www.brooklynbookfair.com and check out the virtual booths that we have here for this book fair. A lot of great obsessive collectors, dealers, you know, who definitely influenced me also in who I have for programming and the exhibitions that I do. There's a lot of really amazing material that they're unearthing and contributing to our culture. So again, thank you so much, Erik, and everybody enjoy the book fair.
Right on.